Welcome to the fourth keynote of DrupalCon Europe 2020. We are extremely excited about this keynote, and who is, I can't think of a better person to come and do the talk and introduce our keynote today. I want to welcome on stage Tara King, one of the leader of the diversity and inclusion team, also representing Pantheon today. Thank you for being here, Tara, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Badi. Hi, everyone. I am Tara King. As she said, I am at Pantheon on our developer relations team and speaking to you today live from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Pantheon is thrilled to once again be a diamond supporter of DrupalCon Europe, and I am especially pleased to introduce Siri Shalazi's talk, Building Diverse, Inclusive, and Equitable Communities. There is a lot of cool stuff happening at Pantheon right now. We have a new decoupled offering, but you all know where my heart is. It's with diversity and inclusion. And I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about what Pantheon has been doing over the last year to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion, both inside Pantheon and outside in our customer community. Internally, we have sponsored employees to work with Drupal Diversity and Inclusion and the WordPress Speaker Diversity Initiative. We've formed employee resource groups for female, LGBTQIA, Black, and Latinx employees, as well as an accessibility working group. We donated $25,000 to Women Who Code for our 10th anniversary, which is super exciting. And recently we released an open source inclusive language guide to improve our communication within our organization as well as. And right now, as part of building our own diverse and inclusive community, we are running a really fun initiative called the Gift of Open Source. This is about supporting Drupal contributions of all kinds from all kinds of Drupal people. We're doing this in our friendly, inclusive, and welcoming forum at discuss.pantheon.io. So whether you're attending Drupal diversity and inclusion meetings today, hint, hint, writing patches for Drupal core, smashing bugs with the Bug Smash initiative, or planning the next Drupal event, your skills are not only welcome, they are needed. So join us. We're holding lots of events for first-time contributors, and we're sending out t-shirts to the first 300 people who contribute back to Drupal. Swing by our booth today to learn more about the Gift of Open Source, our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and of course, we are hiring. So now I'd like to give a little bit of background on today's keynote speaker. Siri Shalazi is a research fellow at the Women and Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School. She works to advance gender equality in the workplace by conducting research on how organizations can become more inclusive, and by bringing evidence-based insights to conferences like DrupalCon, Fortune 500 companies, top professional services firms, startups, and more. Siri provides practical approaches to designing more inclusive workplaces and to debiasing structures and processes. She is a recognized expert in advancing women and promoting gender equality within organizations. Personally, I could not be more excited about this talk because building a diverse, inclusive, and equitable community is critical to the health of the Drupal project. We are so lucky to be able to hear from her today, so please join me in welcoming Siri Shalazi to the stage.
Hi, Tara, and hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you, Tara, for that wonderful introduction. I'm truly so delighted to be able to join you all today to talk a little bit about and to share some of the research on how we can build more diverse, inclusive, and equitable communities. As Tara said, my own research background is in gender, so you'll hear me mentioning a lot of examples that relate to women and men and gender. However, I do want to point out up front that these concepts generalize much more broadly. And so when I'm talking about diversity, I'm not just thinking about women and men or gender diversity, but I'm also thinking about race, ethnicity, nationality, diversity in background, in education, in life experience. You'll see that all of this kind of comes into play broadly. And Nicola, if you help me click to the next slide, I wanted to start with a quick framing thought for our session. Here we have three people who happen to be diverse in terms of their height, and they've all come to see a mountain. But because of this fence, not all of them can actually presently see the mountain. So when we're confronted with this situation in real life, often we react in this following way. If we click to the next one, please. We put different amounts of rocks under people to just barely get their heads above the fence so that they can actually see the mountain. And that's all well and good, but for our discussion today, I'd like us to think of a different kind of world and a different kind of approach. And it's this third panel here where we've actually taken away the fences or the barriers that stand in people's way to begin with and that are preventing them from doing their best work or bringing their full authentic self to work. So what I'm interested in exploring is, what are these fences, these barriers that might be unnecessarily standing in our way, and how can we take them down so that we have a genuinely level playing field for everyone? So that's where we're headed. Let me share with you kind of the roadmap for our talk on this next slide. We're going to start with a quick conversation about unconscious bias. Then I want to introduce you to behavioral design as an evidence-based approach to help us, in fact, create more diverse and inclusive and equitable communities. And finally, I want to leave you with some very specific and actionable suggestions for how you can put this into practice in your own life and in your own work, hopefully as soon as tomorrow. And we'll pause after each of these 3 segments for questions, and Batty will kindly help me moderate the questions. So all throughout the session, if you have any thoughts, any comments, any challenges or questions, please type them into the chat and Batty will take them when the time comes. So let's dive right in and talk about unconscious bias. So here we have a checkerboard on the next slide. And I want you to look at squares A and B, please, and determine which square is darker. Is A or B darker? And I'll ask you to keep looking at these 2 squares as Nicola quickly brings in some blinders that cover up the rest of the board around squares A and B. By now, some of you might want to change your answer. So let's go back, if Nicola will kindly remove the blinders, just to show you that that's truly all we did. We didn't trick your brain. If anything, your brain tricked itself. All we did was simply covered up the board around squares A and B. So this, my friends, is unconscious bias in action. Our brains are bombarded by about 11 million pieces of information every single second. And the conscious part of our brain can only process about 40 pieces of information per second. So in fact, it's the unconscious part of our brain that's tasked with the majority of information processing and decision making. And this unconscious part of our brain tends to rely very heavily on shortcuts and on patterns in order to take in all that information, process it, and make decisions in a reasonable amount of time. And that's exactly what happens on the checkerboard. The moment you saw that slide, your brain recognized a familiar pattern, light square next to a dark square, and you pretty much instantly and unconsciously, without even realizing it, most of us at least, determined that square A is darker than B, which in this case turns out not to be true. If we go back to the checkerboard one final time, please. How many of you still now, looking at this, see square A as being darker than B, even though I've already shown you that they're actually 2 squares of the same color? I think this is actually the most important thing for us to understand about unconscious bias. We all have unconscious bias. It's simply a fact of how our brains process information. It's kind of programmed into us. But our brains are so stubborn that just knowing that we have this bias or just acknowledging its effects is often not enough to overcome them. I'll speak for myself. I've seen this slide demonstration about 10,000 times, and I still look at it and think that square A is darker than B, right? So awareness does not always translate into action or behavior. And in fact, our brains need some additional help. In this case, the help is the blinders that Nicola brings in, which obscure, they take away the rest of the pattern, the rest of the board. And now that the rest of the board is covered, our brains have no trouble seeing that A and B are actually 2 squares of the same color. So we'll come back to this idea of help for our inherently biased brains in a moment. But first, I want to take us from the world of checkerboards into the actual real world of humans and work, and give you a couple of examples of how these cognitive biases that relate to our information processing translate to our interactions with people. So let's go to the next slide. And here I'm going to share with you a brand new study conducted by 3 of my colleagues, Iris Bennett, Ashley Craig, and Clémentine Bonnefanterre at Harvard Kennedy School. And they studied the gender bias that's present, or they were studying if or not there is gender bias on coding practice interviews. So I know many of you out there are software engineers, you code, and you may be aware of these platforms that exist where people who are preparing for coding interviews with tech companies as they look for jobs, they have the opportunity to practice these interviews with peers. So my colleagues studied one of the platforms, one of the most popular platforms, and they had a data set of 60,000 practice interviews. And so in these practice interviews, you have a person who wants to prepare, that's the interviewee, and they're paired with a peer of similar background, of similar coding experience, of similar proficiency to practice this interview. And the evaluator's job is to give them some feedback on their code and give them almost like a grade, a performance evaluation grade. So what this study found was that there is actually a consistent gender bias in favor of men and against women in these evaluations. Both female and male evaluators rate women's code as being lower quality, inferior quality than men's code. So that's some evidence of gender bias. But you might wonder, code quality is actually something that, in some cases at least, can be objectively measured. Because if there's an error, there's an error. So what if we had some more objective information about people's coding performance? Would that make any kind of difference for this gender bias? Well, as it turns out, this practice platform in 2017 made a little process change whereby they started sharing some of this more objective performance information on the quality of the code with the evaluators. So the researchers were able to examine whether that had any effect on closing the gender gap in evaluations. And in this instance, I'm very sorry to report to you that it actually did not. Evaluators did look at that objective performance information. They took it into account, but they didn't at all change their evaluations of women and men's code based on it. And so women still wound up having systematically lower performance evaluations on this platform than men. And I should mention that there were no systematic differences in women's and men's coding skills or ability or sort of past experience, years of experience, those types of factors that could have helped to explain that gap. So this is one example of gender bias in the real world. Let me share with you just one more example real quick on the next slide. And this actually relates to a study on stock brokerage firms in the US. Janice Fanning Madden, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, studied the 2 leading stock brokerage firms in the US and looked at the different stockbrokers' performance. Their job is basically to sell stocks to people, and the more they sell and the more money people make, the more money they make on a commission structure. And the study found that male stockbrokers brought in significantly more revenue than female stockbrokers. In fact, women only brought in about 60% as much revenue. They made 60% as much money as their male counterparts. But when they dug deeper into the data, the research found that actually the women and men performed the same. They performed equally well. So think about that for a second. I'm telling you that objectively, the women are bringing in less money. And I'm also telling you at the same time that they actually performed as well as the men. How is that possible? Well, it turns out that the managers who were responsible for picking who was going to work on which account, they were responsible for assigning work to people. They tended to give the largest and most successful accounts, the ones that historically had the best performance, overwhelmingly to the male stockbrokers. So the issue wasn't actually anybody's performance in being a stockbroker. The issue was the bias of the managers in whom they gave work to. And that completely explained the performance gap, the revenue gap between women and men. Yet another example of how this unconscious, unintentional bias can work to create an unlevel playing field where certain people get an advantage and other people get a disadvantage. So this is what we're up against. Here on this next slide are some very popular approaches for dealing with the effects of unconscious bias in the workplace. My guess is that many of you are familiar with some of these approaches. You might even have experienced them in your workplace. And in fact, I'm curious to see how popular these are. So Batty is going to help me launch a poll. And I'd like you to select any of these options that you've personally experienced, either in your current workplace, in a past job, or even in your life outside of work, maybe in your community service, right? Or even in your involvement with Drupal. So we'll take this quick poll to see how many of these types of approaches you've experienced, and then we'll go from there.
So Siri, we already have 125 votes in.
That was fast.
Yeah, and 135, and I'm still counting. So I think we should just see how many we can actually get. And then we will share the results, right?
That sounds fantastic. Let's give it maybe another 15 seconds. You all are so fast. I'm very impressed to get all those responses in. And I'm actually really curious to see what will come out here.
So what is really interesting is that we have 200 votes. And, you know, I think we can actually just like end it now.
Great.
So I will, it's your last chance. Press the button. They're still coming in. 230 votes. So I'm ending it now in 3, 2, 1, and I press the button. And I think I can share the result with the audience. I'm going to press the share result. So the 29% has experienced mentorship.
Yeah.
27% networking. 19% leadership training. 14% diversity training, and 11% unconscious bias training.
Fascinating. Thank you, Patty, so much for your help with the poll. This is a very interesting finding to me because I just did the same poll last week with some executives from many, many large companies in the US. And we were more in the 70s or 80s% of people who had experienced things like leadership training and unconscious bias training. So there's definitely some variation depending on where you are in the world, depending on what industry you work in, how large the organization is that you work for. But let me tell you something. And maybe it's good that our percentages today are a little bit lower, because while many of these approaches are quite popular, there's actually no evidence, no research to support their effectiveness. Let's take the example of diversity trainings. They have existed for a long time, and my colleague Frank Dobbin at Harvard has been studying the effects of diversity training in corporations for over 5 or 6 decades, 50 or 60 years, in hundreds and hundreds of companies. And he finds that there is zero correlation between the presence of diversity training in an organization and the actual diversity in that organization. Similar findings for unconscious bias training, similar findings for networking. So a lot of money and time is being spent in organizations on things that actually don't seem to have a lot of effect, don't seem to really work. If this doesn't work, then what does? That's where we're heading next. But before I share with you what actually does work based on the research, let's take some questions. I would love to hear what's on your mind. So comments, challenges, thoughts, questions. We'll take a couple of them now before we move on.
So thank you, Siri. I think I'm going to give people a little bit of a chance to write questions. So there is the live Q&A. So you can go in there and put in a question if you have any. Otherwise, there has been a lot of discussion in the chat about the colors. I think some people have even been like doing color picker checks and all that.
I love it. You're getting deep into it.
Yeah.
But you get the point, right? It's obviously a visual illusion, but the point is that what we perceive to be true and what our brains tells us is going on is not always what's actually going on. Our brains have a phenomenal ability to trick themselves. And that's the point of the checkerboard experience.
Yeah. So we have one question from Ruth. So Siri, can you talk about why those particular options for the poll, like, why those options? I think I would assume that that's the question.
Yes, that's an excellent question, Ruth. Thank you. I picked those examples for the poll for two reasons. One is that they are very popular approaches when we talk about advancing diversity and inclusion. A lot of companies that have diversity and inclusion programs, they tend to fall into some of those categories. And the other reason is that those actually are things that we have studied in the past. And we've actually generated evidence on the real effectiveness of those things. I'm a researcher, right? I'm a scientist. And so I'm incredibly sort of disposed toward data. If companies are doing something that they say, oh, here's what we're trying to do to advance diversity and inclusion, I actually care about whether it works. If an organization is going to spend, let's say, $20 million putting all their workers through unconscious bias training, well, that needs to have some return on investment. If 2 years later, we find no change in who works in the organization, in the workforce diversity, we find no change in employees' perceptions of how well included they are, or how whether they have an equal opportunity to succeed, then I would say that was $20 million wasted and 2 years wasted, right? And so I think that's why it's so important to actually examine, to study whether things work, and to keep doing the things that do work and stop doing the things that do not.
Yeah, and Siri, maybe we have time for one more question. So from Danielle, asking, how do you stop your brain from jumping to the wrong conclusions?
Danielle, this is a great question, and it's the perfect lead into where we're going next, because it is so hard for ourselves to actually catch our own brains, to catch bias in action, so to speak. That's the point about our brains being very stubborn and needing some help. So you've actually provided us with the perfect bridge to continue. So thank you, Betty, for helping me with those questions. Let's go back to the slides, and I promise there will be plenty of opportunities to ask questions later on. But let's move on to this exact thing, which is, how can we then help our inherently biased brains nonetheless make better decisions, or to have kind of more objective outcomes? I want to share with you the story of United States symphony orchestras, which about 50 years ago, in the early 1970s, were comprised of 95% men. 95% of the musicians were men at the time. Today, about 60% of the musicians are men. So the share of women has risen from 5% in the early 1970s to about 40% today, which is a very impressive improvement. And the way the orchestras, one of the main things that they did that helped with this transformation was not to put the orchestra directors through any kind of training workshop, but instead they made a small process change into how they hired new musicians. They started auditioning new musicians behind a curtain so that the orchestra directors could hear the music and they could judge the quality of the performance, but they didn't see who was playing. It was a so-called blind audition. And what that curtain did, and the reason it helped, is that it liberated the orchestra directors' brains from any biases, any stereotypes, any expectations that they might have had about what a good orchestra musician looks like, or who looks the part. And instead, they were able to just completely focus on how the music sounded, which at the end of the day is the thing that matters. And so that curtain did for the orchestra directors what those blinders on the checkerboard did for our brains. which is by changing the environment a little bit, by changing the structure or the process or the context, we actually enabled our brains to see what was really going on. And that curtain and those blinders on the checkerboard, they're an example of what we call behavioral design. Behavioral design builds on decades of research on how human brains actually work and how humans actually behave, from fields like social psychology, neuroscience, economics. And we take all of those understandings and we learn how to create decision-making contexts, or in the case of the orchestras, physical environments, or in the case of organizations, processes and policies and systems that essentially help our inherently biased brains to get it right or to make better decisions. Here on the next slide is another example that many of you might be familiar with from back in the day when we were all still traveling. So let's go to the next slide, please. You might have once or twice stayed at a hotel that had this little gadget next to the front door, where when you come into your room, you put your key card in to this little gadget and all the lights in the room turn on. And when you leave your room and you take your key card with you, the lights automatically turn off. Now, if you are the general manager of this hotel and your goal is to conserve energy, right? To save the environment and to use less electricity, there's a lot of different approaches that you could try. You could, for example, put up signs everywhere around the hotel saying, please remember to turn the lights off when you're not in your room. Or you could devise some kind of financial incentive. You could give people a drink coupon or extra loyalty points if when they check in, they sign a piece of paper that says, I promise to turn my lights off when I'm not in my room. It turns out, though, that the most effective way to get people to conserve electricity and to drive down your energy consumption is this little gadget. We don't have to tell people anything. We don't have to put up signs. We don't have to create costly financial monetary incentives. Instead, we've just made a very small change into the environment in which we naturally find ourselves in these hotels. And it turns out that people are much more likely this way to have the lights turned off in their room when they leave. So behavioral design can help us do things that we actually consciously want to do, but where our unconscious brain sometimes gets in the way. Most of us would probably agree that it makes sense for the lights to be off when you're not in your hotel room. But when you're jet lagged and you're tired and you're busy and you're late to your next meeting and you're running out the door and grabbing your everything that you need to go with you, maybe turning the lights off is the last thing on your list. And that's how it sometimes doesn't happen with our human brains that are very preoccupied with the present moment. So behavioral design is kind of the way to trick our brains into doing the right thing, if you will. Let's see if there's any more questions for now before I explain to you how we can bring this concept into our actual organizations and into the work of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So any more questions for the time being, Batty?
Yes, we have a lot of questions.
Oh, good.
I'm looking at them now, and we can maybe start with Christian Snabel, who also put it in earlier in the end. So if the reality differs for people in a more figurative sense, what tools are there to create a diverse space? So if the reality is really different from people.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and actually a deep question, because you're right. Our perceptions of the world and our experiences are very strongly shaped by our background. Broadly speaking, right? Background being where you grew up, how you grew up, what the circumstances were, who you are, both externally in terms of what other people can see, and also internally in terms of your personality, your ways of thinking, and so on and so forth. So in some ways, you could argue that there's no shared reality because kind of each individual has their own unique experience of the world. But in some other sense, of course, let's say organizations, companies, workplaces, they very much do have a shared reality because they need to create policies and processes that apply to all the people who work there, right? So you need to decide, how are we going to hire a new person? Are we going to interview them? Are we going to have them submit a resume? Like, how are we going to do this? Or you need to decide if you are going to allow your people to work from home, to work remotely, or what are the hours when they need to be in the office. And those types of policies and processes tend to apply to everyone who works in an organization. And that's kind of where the shared reality comes in. And in the next segment, I promise, we'll get around to how to create the most inclusive shared reality.
Thank you. So we have more questions from Sergio. I agree that there is an unconscious gender bias. However, do you not think that some objectives are unachievable, like payment? He says, I agree women should be paid the same as a man, but giving the same set of skills, but not even men are having equal payments today. So that's a question. Is this not an unachievable objective?
Yes, fascinating question. I think the point is that, of course, everyone's not going to be paid exactly the same, right? Someone who has more experience, who's worked in an organization longer, who's at a higher level, of course, is going to get paid more than someone who's just starting out. I think the point is that though that difference in payment should not be based on things like gender and race and ethnicity, perhaps disability, that people can't control, right? That the differences in pay should be based on actual performance and actual competence. And what we find today is that there's still a lot of discrimination in pay, where people are getting paid less simply because they're Black, or because they're a woman, or because they're a recent immigrant to the country where they now work. And I feel that that is unfair and unjust.
Thank you. We have 4 more questions at least in now. Do we have time for all of them?
Why don't we take 2 for now, and then we'll save the rest, and we will have more time for questions, I promise.
Okay, so I think because you are going to be talking about some solutions, so maybe we can wait with some of them, because one is actually, what is the best way to quit or repair a community that is excluding people. So maybe we can go to that one directly after.
Yes.
What I would actually like to see here from Clara. Clara says, I worked in a very diverse team before I received any diversity training, and learning by doing is the greatest way. But I am afraid that my learning came at a cost to my colleagues. Diversity training can help to open eyes, but how do you change people if the environment they work in is a boringly uniform?
Yeah, Clara, I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of your question and kind of how deeply you see the issue. I agree. This can sometimes happen where we certainly do learn by doing. If you drop the kid at the deep end of the pool, they're going to start fluttering. But that can come at a cost. As we're learning, in the meantime, sometimes we treat people, we might say hurtful things along the way before we realize that they're hurtful, for example. Or we might unwillingly or unintentionally not give people opportunities that they deserve before we realize, oh my goodness, I haven't been giving opportunities to my colleagues equally. I think, and the research shows, that training can be helpful in raising people's awareness. So invariably, when you survey people after a training session or a workshop and you ask them, did you learn something new? They'll say, yes. Oh my goodness, I learned so many new things, and I now feel much better equipped to, let's say, tackle instances of unconscious bias in my work. But then when we circle back to them 3 months later, or 6 months later, or 2 years later, and we look at, has people's behavior actually changed? We don't see an effect. So that's what I mean when I say that trainings don't work. It's not that they don't do anything. They definitely raise people's awareness, but they don't tend to change behavior. And that's where the kind of structural and environmental interventions or solutions come in. It's very helpful to raise people's awareness, but then they need to go back into a workplace that actually supports their behavior change, helps them to do something differently going forward in order to make it a better environment for everybody.
Thank you, Siri. I think there is one more question I want to just put in quickly, and maybe then we can continue. It's from Ruth again. She says a controversial, but in her opinion, needed change in academic publishing is the double-blind publication peer review. So many papers, they get accepted or rejected because of who the author and or reviewer is. Is there any evidence that double-blind review works?
Yeah, fascinating question. There is a lot of evidence to show that blinding in many forms, meaning just like with the orchestras, making ourselves blind to the demographic characteristics of the people that we're evaluating, does help to reduce discrimination. It reduces bias in the process, and it yields more diverse outcomes. So yes, there's a lot of evidence to support that. There was a fascinating recent research study, though, that showed that sometimes even being double blind doesn't help us go all the distance. This was in the context of grant applications, so not academic publishing, but the evaluation process was double blind, meaning that neither side, the evaluators didn't know whose grant applications they were evaluating. But it turns out that grant applicants, people who are applying for money who were women, they tended to use different type of language in their application. They used some different words compared to men. And the evaluators had a bias in favor of the types of words that men were using. And so even though nobody knew anybody's gender, men were still funded at a higher rate. And the reason was that they were using certain types of language. So I think that the takeaway from this example and from this study is that you're never done. There's always other ways in which unconscious bias can show up. There's always other ways in which we can unintentionally have an unlevel playing field. And so you have to keep digging in deeper to make sure that what you're doing is genuinely providing everyone the same opportunity and being fair. Thank you for that question. And thank you, Betty, once again. So let me share with you 5 specific strategies of how we can actually put behavioral design into practice in our organizations. And then I'm looking forward to more questions. My first example relates to inclusive language, and Tara mentioned this briefly in her introduction to this session as well, this concept of inclusive language. So let's flip to the next slide, and here you'll see a real job advertisement that I pulled off the internet about a year ago. And you'll notice that I have bolded some of these words here. Visionary, warrior, guru. So do me a favor, close your eyes for a second. Who do you picture? What image flashes in front of your eyes when I say warrior? Or when I say guru, what do you see? What does a guru look like to you? Now feel free to open your eyes, back up. I mention this because it turns out that language is gendered on the obvious surface level of words like girls and boys, guys, women and men. But there are also words that don't seem gendered on the surface that actually in our cultural context, in our environment, are strongly associated with either women or men. In this case, words like visionary, warrior, guru, overwhelmingly, not 100%, but overwhelmingly tend to be associated with men. Opposite example, think of a job advertisement, let's say for a kindergarten teacher, that says we're looking for warm and caring and collaborative individuals. I don't have to tell you because you know instinctively that those words are much more strongly associated with women than men. This matters, and I'm sharing this with you because it turns out that language has a huge unconscious influence on how we behave. Studies have shown that job advertisements like this one here, which uses masculine or male stereotyped language, are going to disproportionately attract men to apply. We're going to see many more men applying to this kind of job advertisement than women, just based on the language alone. And vice versa for the kindergarten teacher example, we would see many more women applying. So often what happens is through our language, unconsciously, we are narrowing the pool, or we are tuning off some people in our potential audience. Not intentionally, without trying. The good news is that the fix is actually very simple. Nikolai, if you click forward one, here I've reworded this job advertisement slightly to take away the gendered words and instead use more neutral language that will appeal evenly to everybody. Another option would be to consciously balance out the sort of masculine stereotyped and feminine stereotyped words that you're using to make sure that you're not unintentionally turning off a part of your audience. There are software solutions out there like Textio and Applied that will help you do this. There's also free websites with tools where you can copy and paste in a piece of text, and it'll flag for you if there are gendered words in the text that you pasted in. And I should mention that, of course, gendered language shows up not just in job advertisements, but everywhere where we use language. Think about the text on your website. Think about when you write a self-evaluation or when your manager writes a performance evaluation for you. Think about letters of recommendation. As per the example of grant applications, if you're writing an application for a grant or application to go to graduate school, or someone's writing a letter of recommendation for you, in all of those places, we tend to describe women and men differently. We tend to use different words for old people and young people, for immigrants and native-born people in our country. Those are all examples of unconscious bias, but fortunately, we now have tools at our disposal to help overcome that. Let's look to the next slide and in a similar vein, talk about symbols and role models, which also have a huge unconscious influence on our behavior. And I just want to share with you here the example of a study from the University of Washington here in the United States, which looked at the pictures on the walls of a computer science classroom at university. At first, the pictures were pretty much like what you're seeing here, Star Wars posters, very kind of technical and manly, male stereotyped pictures. The researchers ran a randomized controlled trial where they swapped the pictures instead for more naturey landscapes. Nikolai, if you click one forward, we'll see an example. And these pictures, of course, are sort of more gender neutral. And they were curious to see if this change in pictures had any effect on girls and boys, women's and men's feeling of belonging in the field of computer science and their intention to pursue computer science as a field and to take more courses. It turns out the change in pictures had no effect on men. They were equally as likely to feel like they belonged, equally as likely to pursue computer science, but there was a big change for women. Female students, and this is university students' introductory course, were significantly more likely with nature pictures up on the walls to say that they felt like they belonged in computer science and that they planned to take more computer science courses in the future. Mind you, we didn't tell the students that we were switching the pictures. So this effect was completely unconscious. We didn't draw their attention to the fact that there were now nature pictures up on the walls. So what we see has a huge effect on how we behave and what we think is possible for ourselves. I want you to think for a second about your own organization or the team that you work on, and think about the symbols that are displayed there. What are the screensavers that people have on their computers? Back when we were potentially in a physical office together, who were the conference rooms named after? Or what kinds of pictures were up on the walls? Or what types of images or photos, either of people or other things, are displayed on your company's website? or in your recruitment materials, right? These are just some examples of the many places where we can either choose to model diversity and inclusion, or we can unintentionally and unconsciously exclude people and make people feel like this is not where they belong. This is not a place where they can thrive. Very low-hanging fruit, huge opportunities here. Let's turn to a fascinating aspect of how human brains behave on the next slide. It turns out research shows that our brains, in evaluating options, whether it's people or things, whether we're hiring, promoting, evaluating people's performance, choosing who should get a raise or a bonus, maybe piecing together a team for a special project and deciding who should be on that team, we do much better when we have a bigger pool of people to compare against each other. If I'm asked to just evaluate one person in isolation, my brain has a lot of difficulty in calibrating. Whereas if you give me 5 people to compare against each other, I'm much better able to discern, okay, to kind of rank them and say, okay, who's better and whose work. This comparison, being able to compare, is critical for our brains to be able to make well-calibrated decisions. It also turns out that we generate more diversity in our decision-making when we make multiple decisions at the same time. So let's say you were going to hire next year 3 people, and you're planning on hiring 1 person in January and 1 person in June and 1 person in September. You're actually more likely to hire different types of people, to hire, again, in any way. You know, maybe it's that they're different ages. Maybe it's that one person studied computer science and the other person studied engineering and the third person studied physics, right? Different functional backgrounds. Any kind of diversity. You're more likely to hire more different people when you make those 3 hiring decisions at the same time. And research shows that there's less bias that goes into the decision-making process itself. So here's another simple way to trick our brains into relying less on our biases and into being more objective, is making multiple decisions at the same time and always having points of comparison so that our brains are able to calibrate. Moving on to the role of data on the next slide. You might have heard the saying, you can't manage what you can't measure. And it speaks to the importance of data in helping us understand where we are today and then helping us shape where we want to go. If you don't know what your starting point is today, it's very difficult to actually track and to see whether you've made progress. This picture that I have up on here refers to some recent work that I've done studying the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, based in the UK. And the gentleman on the left here, his name is Roz Atkins. He is one of their presenters. He has a nightly primetime news show on the BBC News channels. And about 4 years ago, he started to have this idea, this feeling that women and men weren't equally represented in his show's journalistic content. He felt like they were probably featuring more men on screen and in all of their stories than women. But there was no data, either for his own show or for any other show at the BBC, to know if that was actually the case. So Roz Atkins decided to generate the data himself. He started counting with his producer at the end of each day's show the number of women and men that had appeared on screen in his 1-hour show. And they put that data in a very simple spreadsheet, and they tallied it up monthly and weekly. And in fact, they discovered in the first month that on average, they featured about 39% female contributors on the show. Once they had that as a starting point and they knew where they were, they could start making conscious efforts to get to 50-50, because the team felt very strongly that since the world is composed of 50% women and 50% men, that should be reflected in who is telling stories about that world, journalists and expert contributors. And in 4 months, they managed to get up to 51% female contributors, and they've been there pretty much ever since then. I'm sharing this story with you to illustrate 2 things. The first is the importance of collecting data related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to tracking it. Because If you don't know what's going on, you can't really do anything about it. But secondly, I'm sharing with this story with you to also show that this doesn't have to be super complicated. This doesn't have to be hard. It can be as simple as what Roz Atkins did, or it can be as simple as you looking at your calendar and seeing who you've recently been taking meetings with. Are they overwhelmingly people who look like you? Are they overwhelmingly people who have exactly the same background? Do you ever touch base with people from another part of the organization, or people who have kind of a different approach to things? As a manager, think about how much time you're spending with all the different people who report up to you. Our natural human tendency is to spend more time with people who are more similar to us because it's more comfortable. But if you see a discrepancy, once you have the data in front of you to say, oh my goodness, I have a weekly meeting with these 4 people who report to me, but these 3 other people who also report to me, I actually don't have weekly meetings set up with them. Why is that? Should I change that? Data is really the first step to change, to make a change and to make progress. Last, and the 5th and final thing I want to share with you relates to our individual behaviors. On this next slide, you'll see 2 beaches. And I want you to look at these and tell me, or not tell me, but think for yourself, which of these beaches would you be more likely to drop a piece of trash on? The left beach or the right beach? My guess is most of you are thinking left, and I'm thinking the same way. But the more interesting question is why? You've now seen this picture of the 2 beaches for about 15 seconds, and already you've drawn sweeping, massive conclusions about what kind of behavior is acceptable and what kind of behavior is not acceptable in both of these 2 environments, with very little information about these environments. This is the power of social norms. Social norms are the shared understandings that we humans have about what behavior is okay and what behavior is not okay in a given context. Our natural tendency is to follow others, to do what other people are doing, to not stand out. We don't want to do things that other people are going to yell at us for, or that we're going to get called out for, because that's not a pleasant experience. We instinctively avoid it. So most of us tend to feel more comfortable dropping a piece of trash on the left beach because it's clear from these pictures that other people have already done it before us. It's probably a behavior that's acceptable in that environment. Whereas on the right-hand beach, probably littering, dropping trash is not an acceptable behavior. Someone might even come tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, excuse me, please pick up your trash. We don't, destroy the environment here on this beach. So I want you to think now about your own environment, your team, your organization. Is that more of a dirty beach or a clean beach environment? So for example, if someone gets interrupted in a meeting and talked over, what happens? Or if someone makes a comment that's racist or sexist or totally inappropriate, what happens? How do people react? Do people chuckle? Do they laugh? Do they look down uncomfortably? Do they call out the person in the moment and say, hey, excuse me, that was out of line? What happens? Or if you are in a virtual cocktail hour or a social gathering, and you realize all of a sudden that half of the team isn't there, that only one half of the team is invited, how do you react? How do you respond? What happens? It turns out that these social norms are very easy to change through behavioral design. Studies have shown that even in groups as large as 100 or so people, 3, 4, or 5 individuals, through what they do and through how they respond to other people's behavior, have the power to shift the norms and the expectations of behavior for the entire group. That's good news because it means that as individuals, not only through what we do, but through how we respond to other people's behavior, we can change norms. We can shift the expectations of how we want people to behave, and we can make our teams, our workplaces more inclusive and more equitable for everyone. So next time you hear someone being interrupted, you could jump in and say, excuse me, I'd really like to hear Jim finish his point, please. Or if you get invited to present at a conference and you can't do it because of a conflict, instead of just declining and saying, no, sorry, I can't make it, you could forward that opportunity to a colleague, maybe someone who wouldn't have gotten that opportunity in the first place because they're less well known, because they don't know the senior leadership as well, because they're more junior, and say, I think you'd be great at this. I think this would be a really good stretch opportunity for you. You should do this instead of me. These are small examples of how in everyday life we can do something called micro-sponsorship, which is really these small daily acts of support to our colleagues, small daily acts of modeling the type of inclusive and collegial behavior that will help make it a more enjoyable environment for everyone. So on the next slide, we have a quick summary of the 5 things that we just talked about. We talked about avoiding gendered or exclusive language, about using symbols and role models to help create environments of inclusion, because seeing is believing. What we see really shapes our behavior and our perceptions. We talked about making decisions jointly and simultaneously whenever we can to help our biased brains, about tracking diversity, equity, and inclusion data, and then setting goals to help us actually achieve the progress that we want to see. And finally, about being a micro-sponsor to create and to reinforce positive, productive norms. For those of you who are interested in learning more, on the next slide, I have the link to the Gender Action Portal, which is a free resource that my office at the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School maintains. And this platform summarizes academic research on how to advance gender equality for practitioners. It's intended for journalists and normal people who are not researchers to kind of gain key research insights. So I highly recommend it. And with that, please, let's spend the rest of our time on more questions. Welcome back, Patty. I'm excited to hear what's on everybody's mind.
Thank you, Siri. I think we only have 3 minutes left, unfortunately. We have a lot of questions, and I would actually like to, there are a few, and one we could start with, going directly into the other one. So number 1 would be, what would be advised to get started with diversity and inclusion in your organization or in your community? And the second question, I would like to jump in right away then. What would then be the best way of actually repairing a community or quitting, or how could you actually fix things inside of an organization or community? So it's a little bit related, I think.
Yeah.
But if you can touch point on that.
So get started. Number 1, collect some data. Understand what's going on. It can be quantitative data, like counting the number of people and saying, okay, well, how many immigrants do we have working for us? How many women? How many people of color? It can also be qualitative data. It can also be talking to someone who doesn't look like the majority and saying, how are you feeling about our workplace? What could be better for you? Do you ever feel excluded? What could we do differently, right? Talking to people and understanding their experiences is also a form of collecting data, and it's very important. So I would start there to understand the baseline. And then how to get started in repairing a community? Small steps. Do something, do one thing. Maybe it's that you institute a new norm or rule in meetings that we don't interrupt people. Or maybe you institute regular coffee chats or quick virtual check-ins with your colleagues to help get to know them better, to build team spirit. It can be small, simple things that don't have to cost money, that don't have to take a lot of time, that start shifting the culture.
So Siri, we are actually hearing that we could extend the time a little bit. So I think that for 5 minutes we could do more questions, and I think that we should have time for that. So that would be great to the Kony team if you could extend the time, and let's then go a little bit through some more questions. There's a question here from Risto about, are studies performed in societies speaking genderless languages? As far as he knows, Chinese is a genderless language. Are there studies around this?
It's a fascinating question. Finnish, which I happen to speak, is another genderless language also. So this has been studied. And the long and short of it is that people who grow up speaking a gendered language as their native language, languages like French and Spanish that have a masculine and a feminine, le, la articles like that, it shapes their thinking. And they tend to ascribe, people who grow up with those native languages tend to ascribe more gender characteristics to things in the world, all kinds of things, even things like table and chair, compared to people whose native language is a so-called genderless language. So absolutely, it makes a difference.
I have a question here from Ricardo, and he was actually, that was directed at myself about my perspective on the current inclusivity in the Drupal community, or as a businesswoman. So I just want to point that out a little, really, because talking from my experience being in the community now for almost 10 years, what is extremely important is to have role models. And I come from a country where we have extremely good role models for somebody like me. I come from Iceland. And when you talked earlier about a warrior, I actually see an Icelandic Viking woman, that's how I see it, because that's like our history. So I think role models are extremely important, and we need to have more of them. And for me, like role models in the business community in Drupal, like having Stella, Anya, Ela from Kokomore, Tiffany, I can count so many, and they have all helped me to like find my stage or my place in the community. So I think like highlighting role models within your community are extremely helpful, and role models can be anything, right? Yeah. So that's from my perspective.
I know that you shared with me earlier that Drupal has made concerted efforts to be very mindful of who presents at conferences, right? And who appears on stage, and increasing the diversity in all of those presenters. And I think that's such a beautiful example of being thoughtful, right? About who is a role model, about who you give a voice and a platform to. So that's fantastic.
Exactly. And thank you there to Tara and everyone in the Drupal diversity and inclusion team. And if you are not already in there, looking at what they're doing, then join that activities. And on Slack, there's a lot of things happening. So let's get to one or two more questions. From Miro. Miro is asking, can you completely remove your bias? Bias is a kind of a preference for something, and that is what makes a difference between us. Won't it make us less human and more robots to be afraid to express your preference?
Fantastic question, Miro. There's two different types of bias, unconscious and conscious. When you have a preference for something that you're aware of, I prefer, let's say, I prefer to work with women more than men because I feel more comfortable with women. That's an so-called explicit or conscious bias or conscious preference, right? What I've mostly been talking about today is unconscious bias, which is the stuff that's influencing how you behave and how you make decisions, but you're not aware of it. So I might say, I'm equally comfortable working with women and men, and I think it's really important to work in an environment that has 50-50 women and men. And yet, if I've picked 80% women on my team, right, I might have had an unconscious bias that I'm not even aware of that's shaping how I behave. There's no evidence to suggest that we can get rid of either our unconscious or our conscious biases. So we talked about how kind of deeply unconscious bias is baked into the human brains. So no, there's no evidence to suggest that we can deprogram or reprogram our brains, but we can become more aware of their effects. And again, by changing the environments in which we operate, we can still we can generate different outcomes.
And one more, I think we have 1.5 minutes left. So you talked a little bit about the tools before, or what we can do. So are you gonna share this anywhere, the slides, or the video will be available, I think, publicly soon. But can you share the slides, or?
I'm very happy to share the slides, and there's a lot written on this, articles, books, and so I'm also happy to share some links to those resources for anyone who's interested in diving deeper. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. I would love to stay in touch, and my email is siri.shalazi, my first name dot my last name @gmail.com. So if you have further questions, I'd also love to hear from you that way. And I just want to say thank you for being such an engaged audience. Thank you for the excellent questions and comments, and for participating in the poll. It's been really a pleasure to spend this time with you, and I wish you all happy and safe holidays.
Thank you, Siri. Bye.